When it comes to soldiers' secondaries, the base jumper isn't one that people tend to pay much attention to. And I mean, why would they? It's not as versatile or role-defining as the gunboats, nor does it give unmatched team-wide power like any of the banners. It doesn't have any raw damage like the shotguns, and it can't even say it has a unique niche for an iconic playstyle as the black sheep that are the man-treads. And, well, it's definitely not as bad as the bison, but let's be honest, the only interesting things to talk about with that thing are just how terrible it is. Whenever I do see talk about the parachute though, it's almost always people talking about how gimmicky it is, how it's only good for meme loadouts, or even how it's a crutch for bad players. Either that, or it's people talking about how it got ruined after its nerf in Jungle Inferno, and even putting the blame on an entire part of the community, but more on that later. And while you may get some occasional arguments for how it's actually really good, not many people have ever gone into detail on the weapon in its entirety, and most of the people who have concluded that it's just not very good. I, however, have been using this thing for quite some time now, and I like this video to be a means to explain my thoughts on it, how I think the belief that it's bad is usually pretty exaggerated, and maybe some slight discussion on ethics and the stigmatization towards a certain group of players in the community, but we'll get there when we get there. For now, allow me to speak in defense of this weapon, as after giving it a good shot, I actually think it can be a very good weapon in the hands of someone who respects it and spends time necessary mastering it. Oh, and while I am aware the base jumper is usable on demo as well, I admittedly didn't spend a lot of time on it for him. Truth be told, I'm not very experienced on that class in general, especially compared to Soldier, but if you did want me to make a video on it for demo, as sort of a follow-up, do let me know. Right, so as with any other video on a specific weapon, I'd like to first explain how the weapon works. Don't worry, this won't take long. The base jumper is a secondary weapon for the soldier that allows you to significantly reduce your fall time by pressing the jump button. At any point you're mid-air, you can deploy the parachute once to instantly reduce your descent speed to roughly a third of how fast you normally fall without it. Once you deploy it, you can retract it at any time, though you won't be able to redeploy it until you hit the ground. There is a pretty annoying bug with that though. If you deploy the parachute, hit the ground, then manage to be in the air again without jumping, you still won't be able to deploy it. This probably isn't something you need to worry about, but if you absolutely do not want it to happen, simply jumping at any point after hitting the ground with a base jumper deployed will fix it. While the parachute is out, your horizontal speed and overall air control is halved, which will significantly slow your ability to do things like air strafing, but it's still not completely impossible. And as for how it works, that's really about all you need to know. On its own, it's a very simple and easy to understand weapon that encourages you to constantly be blast jumping, but why bother using it when you can blast jump perfectly fine without it? Well, several reasons in fact, but the biggest, in my opinion, is simple. High ground. Soldier as a class works extremely well when he has the height advantage. The generous splash damage and radius from his rockets, as well as most classes generally having a harder time hitting you, encourage you to constantly look for that height advantage, and the base jumper gives you it in a way that no other weapon can. Sure, it's not infinite duration like just standing on a platform, but it's also not reliant on the map or position you're playing on. In a way, you can make your own pseudo platforms whenever you're in the air, and if you know anything about Steve and Smash Bros, you can probably tell how powerful that could be. Bombing is also a lot stronger with it, especially against multiple enemies. Normally you can only get 1 or 2 rockets during a bomb before you hit the ground, where you'll have a more difficult time both finishing off any enemies still alive and getting away, since you'll likely be out of rockets by that point. The base jumper though lets you stay in the air for just a bit more time for you to either get one last rocket in a group of enemies, which are much easier to hit because of your height advantage, or reload rockets so you can immediately retreat once you do hit the ground. In fact, I found the base jumper is at its best as a tool for bombing. You might think you should deploy the parachute at the apex of your jump, and while that can definitely work sometimes, most of the time you're just putting yourself at a disadvantage. Not only are you gutting your damage due to fall off, but you're also making yourself a very easy target. Rather, you should instead be deploying the parachute near the end of your jump. That way, the damage fall off isn't nearly as major, and you can do some serious mind games with the enemy. The parachute removes all extra speed and velocity from before you deployed it, and skilled players know to lead their shots when you fall that fast, especially if you're using a projectile weapon. What they cannot predict, though, is you just suddenly falling at a fraction of the speed you were just a moment ago, giving you the potential edge to win a fight that could spell disaster for you. And while we're on the topic of mind games and being unpredictable, some people tend to think they can only deploy the parachute after jumping from their own rockets, but you can use any kind of knockback to your advantage, whether it's an enemy rocket, sticky, air blast, even some Halloween bosses. So long as you end up in the air and the bug I mentioned earlier isn't in effect, you can deploy the chute, which very few people will ever predict, even veteran players. Admittedly though, this is a bit of a fringe scenario, so don't expect it to pop up in every single game. When it does happen though, it can be brutal. It's also very good for chasing down retreating enemies. Since they'll usually be running away from you, they'll be easier and safer for you to hit. It's actually a similar case to the Marker Gardener, in that while your instincts may tell you to back up, most of the time it just ends up screwing you over more than if you were to go in any other direction. Speaking of the Marker Gardener, that weapon works very well with the base jumper, though I personally find more enjoyment from the disciplinary action, since that can give you a good boost to your rocket jumps, and is generally just a really good melee for Soldier. But what about primary weapons? What should you use in tandem with the funny parachute? Well, you might think I'm going to tell you to just use the airstrike and nothing else since it works exceptionally well with the base jumper, which is certainly true, but I actually think both of them are just as effective with most other combinations. Which is a shame because whenever I see a soldier running the airstrike, it's almost always with a parachute and vice versa. If you'll allow me to go on a bit of a tangent though, you really don't need these two weapons combined to do well with either of them. The airstrike in particular works very well with the gunboats, as you'll be able to rocket jump more freely without as much risk of blowing yourself up. You'll have less time to fire rockets with the base jumper, but you'll have the opportunities to do it much more often. That said, the airstrike is a good weapon to use with the base jumper, but don't treat the airstrike like it only works with it and nothing else. It's really fun to use in general, and it's a bit of a shame it's almost always seen as just the primary you use with the parachute. If you do insist on running the airstrike with the base jumper though, I would recommend trying to be a bit conservative on when and where you fire rockets. As enticing as it may be to drop 8 rockets on the enemy medic, you should usually try to spend only as many as you actually need. Fire all the rockets when you don't need to, and you'll have a pretty rough time jumping to safety once you hit the ground. Let me know if you want me to make a standalone video on this weapon in particular, because I really enjoy it with or without the parachute, and I want people to treat it more than just the parachuting rocket launcher. As for the other rocket launchers, honestly pretty much anything works well. I personally use stock the most as it's the most well-rounded primary, but I can't ignore how well you can also do with the black box. I'm gonna be honest, I really don't like using this thing, but in the event that you're playing without a reliable medic, or the map has really bad placements for health pickups, the black box can be a pretty good pick to offset the damage taken from blast jumping, and give yourself some much needed survivability if you do so happen to get caught while parachuting. That's enough praise I'm giving to the black box, we're moving on. Now, a very common gripe I've seen with the base jumper is how it significantly reduces your air control, especially after its nerf back in Jungle Inferno. This is definitely true, but only if you don't know how to effectively airstrafe. I don't mean to downplay anyone, but most of the people who play this game, especially casual players, don't know how to properly airstrafe with or without the base jumper, so they're inevitably going to just press the A and D keys like a noob. But if you know how to properly airstrafe by letting go of W and moving your mouse in conjunction with the A and D keys, you're surprisingly still very mobile while parachuting. It's why you see me in so many clips turning away from the person I'm targeting. Airstrafing effectively like this plays a huge factor in how easy of a target you are with the base jumper. I'll go over this topic later, but for now, back to the weapon itself. There's also the argument to be made about the lack of fall damage. With the parachute deployed, there's no risk of taking any fall damage, save for when you fall into a pit or something. This definitely isn't that big of a deal, at least compared to the other pros I've talked about, but fall damage can add up very quickly, even if you're using the gunboats. And while we're on the subject of the gunboats, I do think the weapon is overall better than the base jumper, but the latter does have an edge in some situations. Accounting for fall damage, you'll be taking around the same overall damage from blast jumping with either weapon, but the gunboats allow you to be immensely versatile and mobile, even if you're not explicitly playing roamer. That said, I don't think it completely overshadows the base jumper. Everything I've just mentioned are things the gunboats can't do, or if they can, just not as effectively nor consistent. Bombing is definitely possible, but there are times where 2 rockets just won't cut it for whoever you're focusing. The base jumper lets you reload more safely in the air, and you'll likely still have the height advantage by the time you're ready to fire again. In the end, both weapons have their own pros and cons, and while the gunboats are definitely the better option overall, there are some moments where the base jumper shines through it. Not all moments, of course, but it's still a decent side bridge for the metal boots. Now, as much as I've been singing praises for this weapon, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. Honestly, I don't think the base jumper is some super busted hidden gem of a weapon that you should use 24/7. At best, I'd probably consider it a mid to low B tier weapon compared to the rest of Soldier secondaries. It's a niche weapon that promotes a niche playstyle that most people aren't interested in, but it's far from unusable. I'm also not trying to say that I'm particularly, good at it.
Damn it.
While I am able to do decently well most of the time, I can't help but just wish I was using any of the banners instead. However, if you're willing to put in the effort to learn it, it can be an extremely effective secondary to complement your playstyle. Whether or not it's worth the effort, especially considering the other secondaries you'll be missing out on, well, that's up for you to decide. But for me, it's a very fun weapon to bust out every so often when I'm in the mood for it. What I am trying to say, though, is I just don't think the weapon is nearly as bad as some people make it out to be. You'll see players say it's either a gimmick and nothing else, a crutch for bad players, or even sometimes just flat out terrible. Why? Well, I think the biggest reason behind its negative perception is really just the fact that most casual players, aka most of the player base, don't know how to use it properly. I mean, we've all seen this before. A soldier with the airstrike and base jumper rocket jumps in the air in a straight line, instantly deploys their parachute, fires off all the rockets at once, and immediately gets destroyed by half the enemy team. So clearly that's the fault of the base jumper, right? I mean, it made you such an easy target for the 3 heavies to delete you, so the weapon sucks, obviously. But is that really an issue with the weapon itself rather than how you, the player, are using it? It's not like it forced you to do a basic pencil jump and make yourself easy pickings, you did that yourself. And frankly, if you were using any other secondary, even the gunboats, you'd probably get punished just as much. It's the same thing as people arguing that the base jumper is bad for when you get caught out by sentries, but how is that a problem with the weapon itself? Sentries are going to counter you rocket jumping regardless of whether using the base jumper, the gunboats, or whatever other secondary, so why is this an issue with the parachute itself? Why does it get singled out like this? And sure, you can be an easy target, but that's only if you become too predictable with it or don't properly airstrafe, a skill that most casual players don't know about. If you just look in a straight line and spam WASD, you're gonna be pretty easy to hit. Know how to airstrafe and play mind games though? Even veteran players can have a difficult time trying to hit a soldier who's slowly descending down right above them while spontaneously changing the directions they're moving, something that you just can't do as efficiently or for as long with any other secondary. But at the same time, I can't necessarily blame these people for thinking this way, because the base jumper encourages you to make bad habits, only to promptly spit in your face when you conform to them. You're encouraged to do basic pencil jumps for the rest of eternity because it gives you the most amount of time to deploy the parachute, so if you're not careful, you can end up making some really dumb mistakes like jumping into a group of hitscan classes by yourself. If you did the same thing with any other secondary, you'd still be just as punished, if not more, but the base jumper is more upfront when you make a bad play, subjecting you to a literal slow burn as you get mowed down, completely helpless to stop it. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, when you die in TF2, or any game for that matter, you should think less of how the weapon you were using caused you to die, and more for how what actions you made led you to dying. The base jumper doesn't force you to use it when you don't need to, just like how the gunboats don't force you to rocket jump for no reason. You, as the gamer behind the mouse and keyboard, have the power to make the most out of any weapon, no matter how good or bad it may be. And sure, sometimes a weapon is just so appallingly bad you really can't get much from it, but I just don't think that applies to the base jumper. Heck, the same thing happened to me back when I first started using it. I would constantly do standard rocket jumps they teach you in the first 5 minutes of Jump Academy, and when I inevitably died from being so predictable with it, I wondered if the weapon really was as bad as most people made it out to be. But once I realized why exactly it wasn't working out and how it had more to do with my own skill than the weapon itself, it suddenly became a lot more effective and, honestly, fun. Moral of the story here is, don't immediately put the weapon you're using at fault for a mistake you made. Rather, use what you learned to improve your skills and your ability to use the weapon to its fullest. That's the best way to grow as a player, not blaming something just because you're not able to make it work with the way you're playing. I've also seen people say the weapon is a crutch for players who are bad at airstrafing, and while I do agree to an extent, I only think so if you use it like one. If you constantly airstrafe for turns that are totally possible with any other secondary, then yeah, you can definitely end up being over-reliant on it and get worse at the game overall. But at the same time, the smaller, more precise airstrafes are completely unique to the base jumper. You can't do crazy stuff like 360-degree turns without the base jumper, or if you can, you're gonna lose a lot of momentum from it. But that's really my biggest issue with the weapon as a whole. It's not overpowered or even underpowered, it's just unhealthy. It subconsciously encourages you to act like a noob and overly rely on it without even realizing it's happening. And I can't think of any other weapon that suffers the same thing to the same extent. And while we're on the topic of unhealthy mindsets, can we please stop blaming everything on competitive players? I have seen way too many people accuse the competitive scene for not only the base jumper, but other weapons like the caber and the steak sandwich being nerfed because pro players were allegedly complaining to Valve about it, even when they don't have any sources backing them up. The patch notes for the base jumper never mentioned anything about competitive player feedback or even anything to do with skill level. The only reasoning they had behind the nerf was because it could have been difficult for players to hit users, and sure, it was because of the ability to constantly retract and redeploy the parachute and the immense air control, but I don't think I need to tell you how that's not something exclusive to organized matches in any fashion. Anyone was able to abuse a weapon in any setting, whether it was casual, competitive, a community server like Uncle Topia, or even 24/7 Hightower servers. How could this possibly be exclusive to organized play? And even if the nerf was because of competitive feedback, would it really be good for the game if the base jumper never got these nerfs? I do believe the nerfs were necessary, let me be clear, but so many people tend to believe the nerf ruined the weapon or made it unusable, which, to be fair, was the case for other weapons, but it feels like a lot of these grievances, especially for the base jumper, are vastly over-exaggerated. It makes me wonder how many people have actually given these weapons a fair try, and I don't mean playing it for one round and jumping to conclusions. I'm not trying to say you're wrong for thinking the weapon is awful, or any weapon for that matter. That's obviously an opinion that I will respect, but only if you've given it a fair chance and are willing to adjust your playstyle to acknowledge how you use it. And that's not to mention how the people who accuse pro play for weapons being nerfed never have any kind of evidence to support these claims. They're all just baseless scapegoating masquerading as truth. Why are we putting the blame on these people? Because you don't like competitive? What, did everyone just watch Trickle Down Balance and immediately assume every nerf was the fault of pro players? Hi, Future Batluna here. I was debating on whether or not to include this, but after doing the voiceover for the video, I decided this should be clarified. So the base jumper was banned in RGL6s for overall making the game more annoying. A soldier using the parachute would force the enemy team into a lose-lose situation, where they had to either focus the soldier down with chip damage or the potential direct rocket while taking heavy fire from the rest of his team, or focus on everyone else while the soldier gets free, near uncounterable damage from above. This is an issue since the standard 6's team comp doesn't have any snipers, heavies, or NGs outside of holding last, who are the biggest counters to the base jumper. While the Rumpus also made a point that rocket surfing as a medic was substantially more difficult because of the angle the soldier was constantly able to fire from. I'm not very knowledgeable on that regard, but I will take his word for it. The nerf in Jungle Inferno didn't address any of the issues 6's players had with the weapon. It's still really difficult to hit a soldier with the standard team comp, and medics still can't effectively rocket surf when using it. So it's stayed banned ever since. ETF2L unbanned the base jumper back in September 2024, but it doesn't see much use anyway, assumingly since the gunboats and banners are just so much better, in spite of all the praises I've been singing about the weapon this whole video. It's unbanned in 9v9, but since heavy, sniper, and NG are always threats you'll need to deal with, the weapon doesn't see a whole lot of play, because of both the 9v9 format and the fact that the banners are better in pretty much every way. This just further proves my point that Valve wasn't taking the competitive scene into consideration when nerfing the weapon, or if they did, they completely missed the point on why it was banned. And honestly, at this point, it could be either or, but no, I don't think competitive feedback was the ultimate factor in Valve deciding to nerf the weapon. The topic of how the base jumper almost completely trumps most classes outside of 3 should be addressed more though, and nowadays that's definitely my main issue with the weapon as a concept, regardless of whether it's in a 66 environment or casual or whatever. That's a topic for another video though, and frankly this one is way too close to completion for me to address it further. Feel free to watch Solar Light's video on sentry guns to get a better idea on hard counters in TF2 after this one. Alright, back to the ethics. Look, you're allowed to have your own opinions of the competitive scene, just as much as you're allowed to have opinions on weapons and the balance changes Valve made to them. But just don't make shit up. I know Valve isn't very communicative when it comes to changes, and it's okay to have your own theories, but you shouldn't be treating them as inarguable facts when you don't have any evidence to back yourself up. And you especially should do your own research on why a weapon could have been nerfed in the first place. Again, Valve has never been particularly upfront for most of them, but try looking for people's opinions on the weapons before they were changed. Try to find how many were complaining about it being too weak or too strong. Find out the kinds of people who were making these claims, whether they be casual or competitive, then form your own opinion. Hell, I couldn't care less about competitive TF2. I just don't think it's an environment that supports the playstyles and classes that I enjoy. But you're not gonna see me putting the blame on its players because a niche weapon that was objectively flawed got nerfed. And I encourage you to not do that either. Because the sooner we all realize that Valve and Valve alone decide what weapons get changed, the sooner we can agree that they're actually not very good at balancing their games in general. Okay. Tangent over. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah. The base jumper. So we've gone over the practical uses of the weapon, talked about its biggest flaws, and had an important ethics discussion. But there's still the question on how the weapon should be balanced. How can it be a weapon that doesn't support bad habits, is fun to play with and against, and can make a stand for itself from the other secondaries? I have no idea. Yeah, I know, that's not really a satisfying answer, but this thing is just such an enigma to me that I'm not really sure how to balance it while keeping the core functionality of an on-demand parachute. A part of me wants to say that there really isn't any good way to buff or nerf it. You could add a strict time limit for how long you can have it deployed, but if you make it too long, the nerf may as well not even matter, and if you make it too short, it'll feel like ass to use. Some people have suggested adding a mechanic like the Tide Turner, where taking too much damage forces you out of the parachute, but it would just end up being even worse against hit-scan weapons, which are already its main counter. Plus, it would honestly just feel terrible to use at all times with either class. And honestly, the fact that this thing is kind of a balancing nightmare just sucks. It sucks that it will likely never be in a perfectly balanced state, even if Valve suddenly decided to make balance changes again. It especially sucks because I really like this weapon. Again, I'm not trying to convince you I'm a godlike player with it, because I'm just not. Honestly, I'm probably only a bit better than most of the players who ever used it. But do I care? No, not really. And why should I? It's a gimmick weapon, and far from the best compared to the rest of Soldier's Kit, I won't deny that. But at the end of the day, I like using the base jumper because it's fun. Really fun, actually. And yeah, it can feel a bit cheap at times, and other times I will swap out of it because it's just objectively not always a good option for a slew of reasons. But when I do feel like rocking the parachute, it can be really fun, and at the end of the day, I'm glad it's able to exist in the game, in spite of its flaws, and I don't think I'm ever not gonna have fun with it. If you do want to try out this weapon for yourself, then the biggest tips I can give to you are practice rocket jumping and especially air strafing, know when you're forming bad habits from it, try to do mind games when you do deploy it, and most importantly, have fun. It may not be for everyone, but for people like me, it can be a really fun weapon, and at the end of the day, that's really the most important part. And as long as you're willing to put in the effort, I'm sure it can be fun for you too. Unless you're playing, like, Junction or something. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider dropping a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments below, as always. Any engagement with a small channel like mine is greatly appreciated, even if you don't agree with some of the points I made. If you are interested in more of my content, whether it be related to TF2 or not, I'd appreciate if you could also subscribe to the channel. I still have some future videos I want to make in the future, so don't miss out. Oh, and one last thing, I have a coffee. It's a bit bare bones, it has some decently outdated art posts, but if you want to support the channel more directly, feel free to donate. Either way, thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy parachuting!